So I'm going to be going over hammer veneering, traditional techniques that were commonly used in the period, and the approach that possibly cabinet makers in the old days would have done. Basically, hammer veneering, or it's used with high glue, which is a natural protein glue. It's been around forever. So they used to come through it's basically what Jello is kind of made out of as well, gelatin, Jello. So there's some form of high glue in the food processing. And high glue, if you don't know, is just simply mixed with water, kind of 50-50. And the consistency that you desire to have in high glue is a little bit like light cream. And if it's too thick, you just add water. And if it's too thin, you essentially have to, cook it. And essentially, it has a bit of a yellow or golden brown tone to it. And you want to just like have it float off the brush like light cream, essentially, if you can imagine that. For anyone who doesn't cook, then you have to figure that out. So usually here in New England, Eastern white pine is a very common material. And it's very common, the reason being is that obviously it's everywhere, but it's also very common in furniture because it's very lightweight. It's easy to process with hand tools. It's easy to work, obviously. It doesn't really weigh too much, and it's amazing how quickly you can work it with very basic tools. So that's kind of the focus and the advantage that we have here. And the reason why we like to use high glue, even today, compared to modern day glues, is that high glue is 100% reversible. It doesn't affect any of your finishes. So if you ever use yellow glue and you're gluing something up and you put some finish on it and you got this little blotchy spots, well, high glue doesn't give that to you because it's a natural protein glue. And if it's a natural finish like shellac or lacquer or an oil base, the blotching doesn't occur because they're somewhat natural. They've been modified, but in the overall basic sense, they're still 100% natural. So besides it being 100% reversible, now when I say reversible, it does take a lot of effort. You're not just going to be able to go ahead and put some water on it and be like, oh my God, this is just going to come apart. Because actually you have to wick in the steam and you have to actually heat it up really well and you have to use palette knives to make it reversible. And then the only glue out there, if you ever have to repair anything at home or any of your tools or any of your furniture, the only glue that sticks to itself is high glue. Everything else, you actually have to make sure that every single ground of adhesive is gone. Also, if it's porous, the material in the pores need to be removed. So that means either you have to bore the hole deeper or you need to scrape it a little bit more. And by you scraping, sometimes even the walls may get bigger, so then you have to fill those in or find a way to make it fit nice and tight again. But if it's high glue or any protein glue, it actually dissolves itself and bonds to itself. So it's easier to clean up or easier to work. So as a restorer, that not only saves me time and money, it also saves the client time and money because I don't have to worry about having to clean out all the joints and everything else. So those are kind of win-win options. The other advantage of high glue is that, which I'm going to show you in a few seconds, is that when you hammer veneer, does everyone know what hammer veneering is? No? So hammer veneering is not actually hammering, it's more of a squeegee. So in today's world, we make our own kind of veneer hammers, and this is just a block of wood with a piece of brass in it. Okay? Now, there's come in a variety of different sizes. Here in America, everyone wants it to be nice and big, but everything in France, this is what they teach over there and overseas in the cabinet making, is nice and small. It's somewhat much more primitive. It's literally, you can almost say it's like a dough mixer, which is a perfect example right here. Some people say you can use it for, cheese slicing as well. You can just blunt the edge, and that works out really well. Now there are metal forms, and these are perfect examples of 1900s versions. This is, 19th century example from France. These are handmade by a blacksmith, and they would use cast iron, and the reason being, or some sort of metal, and the reason being is that this gets nice and warm with the glue, so it keeps the glue pliable, so it'll be able to work the glue really easily. So that's the advantage of this. So I can pass these around so you can see an example of a period one. And this one comes from France. And sometimes you don't need a handle. Some people say you do need a handle. You know, you really depends on the person and individual. But basically, what I'm going to show you here is I'm going to show you how to make up a simple panel, like if you can imagine, is a iron that have sawtooth of a cutting edge. So there's a variety of different teeth in there. And what that does is that creates cavities in the substrate. When it creates cavities in the substrate, what it does is that when you get ready to use glue, once the glue gets into the cavities and you get ready to squeegee on the veneer, what happens is that the veneer, as it's drying, it's shrinking. And when it's shrinking, it's also pulling the veneer with it. So there's some centrifugal force that's occurring by you squeegeeing it down. So magically, that's the benefit of using high glue. And it's quick tack, and it's fast, and works really well.
And it's reversible.
Yeah. No, that's one of the main givens why it's really good. So what you usually do first is after you hand plane a substrate, which I'm going to do here with a bench plane, for some odd reason, this bench doesn't have bench dogs, so it'll be kind of awkward as I try to work this. But you'll get the gist of it. After each item gets hand planed and nice and smooth, you can go ahead and tooth it. Now the toothing does two things. No, more than two things, really. This is very common if you want to work very difficult materials like crotch or tiger maple or anything highly figured. And no matter what you do with your hand planes, if something's tearing out, if something's working against you, you can go ahead and use a toothing plane to mill down the surface. The reason being is that the toothing plane doesn't read grain direction. It doesn't care if it's going across the grain or with the grain or how figured it is. So this also, what this does for you is that if you're toothing a whole surface and for some odd reason the toothing pattern is not in a certain area, it tells you there's a low spot. It tells you that there's going to be a hollow spot when you try to veneer. So what you want to do is you want to have to consistently hand plane everything down to a certain level with a toothing plane, and the toothing marks give you a witness mark. It tells you that, all right, I'm all set. It doesn't have to be flat. It has to just appear it's flat. You know, everyone has a method of madness, but, you know, unfortunately wood always moves. So you have to basically get everything as close as you possibly can. Now the other thing is to be aware of when you do tooth a board, you want to make sure that you go part way, halfway. The reason being is sooner or later what happens is since the teeth are grabbing, it's not like a hand plane. You can't just take off. What occurs is a lot of people start doming over the ends. So what you do is you come halfway, you turn it around, you come back the other halfway. Now, this is a French model. This is an American model. Okay, there's about 3 different cutters in the veneers, in the veneer scrapers or the toothing plane. The coarsest one usually is set up for oak or substrates. The medium one is set up for veneers, and then a really fine-toothed one is set up for marquetry examples, so that the grain direction is going all over the different areas, and you don't want anything to tear out at that point, so the teeth are very fine. So the fine ones are very difficult to find, and there's about 20 teeth per inch at least on the fine ones, and on the coarse ones per inch you can say it's 9 or 10 teeth per inch. So those are the differences that you can find, and the finer ones are really sought after, especially today, because they're really fine and so many people are not really using a toothing plane as much. So all you do is essentially you go ahead and hand plane this with the grain or against the grain, doesn't matter. And you want to have a kind of a cross hatching pattern, so you'll go with the grain and then you go diagonally. And essentially what you want to do is see that the tool is actually leaving its tracks. So you're creating kind of a cross hatch pattern. And when you veneer, I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? Or no? You can
Probably
see
not
it?
the.
So I'll pass around the toothing plane. If anyone hasn't seen it, you can compare the French and the American. The reason why I like to pass things around is so that no one falls asleep.
You gotta be careful with this group, though.
Freddie, is this the medium teeth that are in these two?
Excuse me?
The medium tooth?
Yes. One's slightly coarser, because it's French, and then there's one that's American that's just slightly finer. But both of them, I would say, are still coarse. Once the surface is all tooth, essentially, we are ready to go ahead and veneer. If you want to tell an age of a piece of furniture, if you see a lot of stress cracks on a piece of furniture, usually that dictates the age, or that helps dictate the age. A lot of stress cracks means it's more of a modern.
Excuse me, can we adjust this camera somehow so that you're not standing in front of what we're looking at?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, I'll try to.
Maybe put it up above your head so we can see what you're doing on the bench.
Or I can move the
Okay.
bench, or whatever you like. I unfortunately do not know either, because that was already established.
Here, should we slide the bench down?
I can slide the bench down. No.
You got a piece under there. There's a piece under,
It's fine.
there's a piece under the bench. No, it's not.
It's okay. I knew it was gonna fall. You have enough room there still?
Yeah.
Is that better?
That should be much better, thank you.
You're welcome. I said the same thing in the beginning, so thank you for saying something. So in the period, a lot of thick old veneer, you can tell its age because it doesn't have a lot of mini small cracks. It has major cracks because the veneer is actually about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch thick. Today's veneer is about a 40th or a 32nd at times, and those have mini stress cracks everywhere. So you can tell if it's been, any parts have been replaced, or you can tell that anything is not as old as people may think, or you can say that, well, actually that's not as old at all. So you're unfortunately incorrect. But if you can help it, there's suppliers out there that sell veneer still today at 1/16 of an inch, but if you can resaw your own, it's even better. The advantages of cutting your own or making solid stock is the veneer is not very thin. So in case there's some areas that need to get hand planed or sand or scraped, you can afford to do that. If it's really thin, there's a chance most likely that you're going to blow through it and all your efforts are kind of destroyed. So you kind of have to, weigh those options out. Today, unfortunately, you can't find like crotch mahogany too often in solid stock that's really thick or in solid veneer. So you have to kind of live with what you can get. Sometimes what happens is that when I get crotch mahogany, I cross veneer, essentially 2 pieces of veneer to give me some thickness of the same species. What that also does for me is that gives me the capability of making it more stable because I'm essentially kind of doing plywood laminations, solid core. But if you can help it, you get something really thick, and then what you can do is simply use high glue, which is already mixed up in this pot at about 140 degrees temperature. There's cast iron versions as well out there, but the difference between this and that is that you have to really maintain the cast iron and make sure that you set the temperature right over the fire flame if you want to do it that way, or using electric burner. So now that my substrate is ready to go and it has been toothed, I can go ahead and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the high glue, I'm going to put glue down on the substrate, I'm then going to lay this piece down, put glue on top of it, and then actually I'm going to flip it over and put glue on top of that and then squeegee it off. The reason why I'm using this procedure is if you only put moisture on one side on a piece of wood, you obviously probably know, it's going to cup away or towards the moisture. So by you quickly putting the down face a little bit of glue, it basically is going to prevent itself from fighting, and then you put some more glue on top, adding some moisture, but really what you're doing is you want to use it as help squeegee the glue out. And then it should relatively hold itself down. Now if the material is really wavy and out of round or out of flat, then it has to be flattened. And usually to determine if you need to flatten a piece of veneer, you would use like a ruler going across it, and if you can put a dime anywhere underneath that ruler, usually it's too much of a wave, and then it has to be flattened. That's kind of a technique that was used in the old days. They will still use a pence and figure out how to determine they need to flatten their veneer or not. Any questions so far? No? Only 2 people have fallen asleep, so I'm doing something right. Now the gram strength I'm using here is called 192 gram strength. And it gives me the ideal open time that I desire.
Where does that sit in the range?
It's about middle.
About the middle.
You know, it can go all the way down to 50, or it can go all the way up to 300 and change. The lower the gram strength, the more flexible it is. The higher the gram strength, the more brittle it is. When you do harps or harp repair like I do, we use about 300. The problem with that also is that it doesn't give us enough open time, so you really have to work really quickly. And I'm just using a ox hair brush here. It's nothing fancy. I'm not painting this on. I'm just trying to spread it as quickly as I can. And then you can basically work from the center out, and essentially what I'm doing is I'm literally squeeging all this glue out. I have a little bit of a crack here, so I'm trying to squeeze all the glue in there and pull the crack together. If it was really cold, if I was doing this outside, I would have to work even quicker because the moisture that's evaporating is what really sets the glue. Now the glue sets quickly, but it doesn't dry 100% for 24 hours at least. So that's kind of the only disadvantage of high glue. But the main advantage of it is, if you're doing a lot of veneer work, is that you don't have to wait at all, and you can continually be building up the panel. And you just keep going. You know, this is a sloppy mess usually, but literally, this is all it takes. And literally, you know, sometimes I wonder why there's a handle there, because this is all I'm doing. But now there's no reason for me to ever need a vacuum bag or anything like that, because this is pretty much all laid down.
Have you rounded over the front edge of the brass?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. I round over the front edge of the brass really smooth with sandpaper because I don't want to damage the veneer.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't really matter too much on a thickness like this, but say if it was at a 40th of an inch thick, you know, any little crumb or any little hard spot will damage the veneer, and it's basically become a very bad day quickly. So obviously you don't want to put any glue on the veneer because any glue would add moisture to it and it wants to cup towards that. But you obviously have to have some around so you can clean yourself up as well as clean your veneer hammer. And sometimes what happens is, if it was properly set, I would keep that over warm water so that it's also warm and it helps with applying the veneer and keeps the veneer still somewhat tacky. I'm just wiping the edges here and cleaning off this bench because this is not my bench. If it was my bench, I probably don't even worry about it until later on. Now say if I'm going to go ahead and continue building up this panel, and I want to go ahead and add some banding to this. If you're using modern day adhesives, you know, you have to at least wait an hour. Sometimes, most often than not, you have to wait 24 hours. But with high glue, essentially, I can go ahead, set up my marking gauge, and continue working. So now, if I want to go ahead and put a little bit of cross banding or a little bit of banding, say, and I'll quickly pass this around in a second, I can go ahead and set this up to the desired width by either miking it off of this or using a ruler, depending on how anal you want to be. I'm in between, so sometimes I want to double check my work. And with I also make my own banding. The reason being that if I can make the banding the same exact thickness of my veneer, then there's very little or no scraping. So that gives me the capability of not truly affecting or removing material on something that's may possibly be already thin. Now, if this was already a 40th of an inch thick, then I would not make my banding a 40th of an inch thick, because that'd be too labor intensive. But I would probably make it just a hair heavier, so that it just makes my life easier. So with this all set up, I can literally set up my cutting gauge, and hopefully I set it up right in this light. I can scribe it. And this cutting gauge, essentially, the reason why I'm using that term is it has a knife for its cutter. And literally, I can remove that section, and still, this is adhered down. Then I can literally, if I did this correctly, lay this right against the edge. And since the glue is still even not all the way tacky, I could probably just leave it on there. As a possible option. And that's what I'm going to do. And then what you can do is literally just cut the other end with a chisel right in the end. And then if I wanted to continue doing that, I literally can take the same exact piece. If this is perfectly flush, you're good to go. If not, you can take a chisel and chisel any areas off. I think by luck, that's pretty darn close. Since the glue was not all the way tacked down or fully dry, I don't even have to apply any glue on this side to tack that down, which is another great advantage of using high glue. Then I can literally take this cutting gauge and go across the grain. Ideally, you don't want to go ahead and scribe this all really quickly and really hard. You want to take multiple passes. And everyone says, oh, you know, this high glue is great for interior stuff. Well, what about exterior? Well, high glue is just as good for exterior. You have to imagine back then they only had one glue. They didn't have epoxy. So basically they would just use high glue for exterior post and exterior work. And it worked perfectly fine. You gotta make sure that this doesn't move on you. Hopefully it didn't move on me. Going across the grain takes a little bit more effort than going with the grain. You can pop that off. Again, you can take a chisel and make sure this area is nice and clean. But again, there's no waiting. I just cut that corner nice and clean. I can then, if I had to, take a small glue brush, if I feel there's not enough glue here, and simply just re-tack this down. You can also be able to match the grain if you wanted to. And that's literally it. And if you had to, if you're concerned, you can literally spread your fingers as a clamp, and you can count just about to 30 seconds, and you're done. So now this is nice and clean, and miters around the corner, and the decorative border is already happening quickly for you. I can go ahead and add stringing to this. I can go ahead and add any other details, any corner fans. There's no waiting. So when you see account books out there and they say, oh, you know, one day, you know, veneer all of the drawer fronts of a chest of drawers with banding and everything, most likely it's telling you that they used high glue, and there's literally no waiting whatsoever. If there was any waiting, it's basically any delay that occurred was from, as they were working on all the drawers, they made sure that the glue just tacked up a little bit more. You can miter them in the corners if you wanted to, but for this demonstration, I thought it would be easier just to go ahead and butt them up, just to kind of give you an understanding of what the whole thing looks like. So, literally, this lays perfectly flat. The other advantage of this is that if you were going to finish this, the high glue is already helping you fill the pores of the wood. So it's already giving you the benefit of that you have to use less finish when doing this. Now if you want to cut any stringing in the groove, say for a furniture leg or something, I was with Bill in the other room, and there was a gentleman that had some tools for barrel making, and in there in one of the tools, if you go back over there, you can see a cutter that has multiple teeth, and they look like a cross cut. When I looked at that, that automatically gave me like the light bulb in my head just turned on. And since what happens with a lot of this work is that they're in the same neighborhoods, and you see each other every day, and they're interacting in the bar, and they talk about tools and experiences. And I'm sure they were sharing tools and knowledge back and forth. So I probably believe that that tool over there, the cutter, was used for cutting grooves to make the stringing on the legs. It makes perfect sense because they're already using a blacksmith to go ahead and do that for them, and they already were filing the teeth. So why not take advantage of that tool and use it here? The other possible option is a lot of these individuals would use their saw blades. In the period, they say saw blades are being sharpened every 2 weeks. So you can imagine how often these guys are using their hand saws. So you can imagine how quickly their hand saws are being worn down. And sooner or later, the guy's like, you just gotta buy a new hand saw. So what do you do with saw plates? Saw plates automatically become scrapers. Scrapers automatically can get modified, and they can get them ground down. You can use a tooth, and you can shape the tooth of the file, and then you can cut grooves in a furniture leg. So I'm not sure if this will work over here or not, but I'll try. Since the camera's over here.
It'll work over there. So,
You can zoom there clear
Yep.
enough? Okay. So essentially, depending on the veneer thickness, you have different cutters. So for me, this one right here is 3/64 of an inch. So only a 16th or 64th bigger than a 16th, or a 64th smaller than a 16th.
That's a scratch stock?
Yes. And I'll pass one around so you can see. So what I'm doing here, if you can see this up there, if not, I'll pass this around, is I'm cutting a groove. This scratch stock was basically an old saw blade that ground all the teeth off, and I filed and ground basically a straight little cutter that's exactly the thickness of my veneer. So there's a little bit of play time there. And then I hone that tooth with slipstones so it's sharp enough to scratch a groove into the surface. Then the only way to test it is to literally cut a piece of veneer, which I can show you how I did that, and literally put it inside the surface to make sure if it's tight. If it's too tight, you have to grind down the tooth. If it's, or make a bigger tooth. If it's too small, then you have to get a new cutter. So you can see that there's some accuracy involved here. It's very time consuming. So you can imagine that back in the old days, where the whole secrets, that saying that, they like to keep secrets, they're not really keeping secrets. What they're doing is, they don't want to show you how easy this is. Okay? I don't believe there's any real secrets in our trade. It's more of that, if I showed you how easy this was, then I would lose out, because you'd be like, oh my God, this is stupid easy. So I believe that this approach here is really stupid easy once you see it and you can do it. And usually the depth of this groove is about 3/32 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch. Some people like to go thinner, but the way I look at it is, what happens in the future when your piece is going to get restored? And then, the arrogant woodworker will say, well, my pieces are never going to need to be restored. That's why I make them today. And it's like, unfortunately, every single piece that's ever made is going to need to get restored. And unfortunately, our craft of restoration is dying off, so there's not enough educated people who know how to restore. So you can pass this around. I'll give you a cutter also, so you can see. And if they happen to scrape it all, or they happen to sand it off, if you only went in a 32nd of an inch, the veneer is going to disappear. But God willing, they're not going to sand off in 3/32 of an inch off your furniture everywhere. So hopefully you can say it went through one process of restoration and the veneer is still there. So that's why I prefer to go ahead and make it as deep as that. And essentially on all my legs and everything else, that's how that's made. And you can do the same thing when it comes to using a scratch stock on this. And again, there's no weighting. Like even if I have to go ahead and clean this up with a chisel or anything like that, I can. The only issue is that, the vise gets some get some glue in there, but you can just wipe it down with water. What I'm doing here is I'm flushing up the veneer to the surface, and you literally want to let the wood talk. If you start hearing crunching like Rice Krispie treats or Rice Krispie cereal, it means you're going in the wrong direction. Now the issue with this is that if you wait the next day to cut any of these grooves or any of the veneer off, as the glue dries, it becomes more and more difficult to work. So you have to kind of just plan accordingly. Say if I was going to put more than just banding around the surface. So I'm already getting too tacky here. So that's one thing so you could quickly see. That's already getting really tacky and becoming a little bit more challenging. If I was going to put some stringing, which is simply black, white, black in this detail, I can easily go ahead and just slide this in place like so. And again, taking advantage of the tack from the first time around when hammer veneering. And if you time this properly, which the craftsmen did in the old days, it's literally that's it. It's like, you know, simply just applied there. And then if I want to go ahead and add some cross banding to that at the proper width, I can just simply add that to the stringing, and I'm already creating a border. So even the scrap that craftsmen were taking off their pieces are then simply reapplied. Because what happens is, like, if they did this to every single board, they're going to look over there and it's just like, that material is very precious. What can I do with it? And they quickly became very innovative. And they said, well, I can probably add that cross banding because it's going across the grain on two sides at least and gives me a different 3D look. So I'm going to pass this around so you can go ahead and see this as well, because this allows the person next to you to kind of push your shoulder. So that's a quick example of veneering using high glue. Can you use other modern adhesives? Yes, but this gives you so much advantage over all the other ones. It's incredible. So the other thing I was going to go over is essentially show you how to make some banding. And I kind of also want to show you a modern technique of how to do this as well. If many of you are fearful of veneering, another modern approach is what I'm going to share with you now. What I like to do is, if I have to use modern veneers, is if the veneer is very thin and I'm scared that it's going to move, it's going to crack, it's going to stress, then what I like to do first is, a perfect example is, this is mahogany, and I'm going to put a mahogany crotch on the surface in this. The wood, the grain is going left to right. The veneer is going north to south. Okay? Essentially what I want to do is I'm trying to establish somewhat of a lumber core plywood. And I veneer this on first, and then what I do is I like to put packing tape right in here, all the way around. And I will set up my cutting gauge to the banding width that I desire. And with this wrapped with packing tape, I basically strike a line all the way around and remove the center where I'm going to be veneering to. But I leave the tape on the exterior. I will then veneer the whole piece with the contrasting material or the crotch, and with the same exact cutting gauge setting, I will strike this line all over again. What this does for me is that if I happen not to have time in that day to remove this veneer, or if I am using a modern adhesive, by you using the tape, the glue doesn't adhere to the tape. So what that does is it allows you to quickly scribe everything and just peel it off with the tape. And it gives you a nice clean flat surface all the way around. So that when you take the banding next, you can simply just push this up against it and it's perfect, and then you can go ahead and put tape. So that speeds up time and allows you to use different adhesives. That's one way of doing it. So I have an example here also that explains with veneer, it's still very soft and somewhat can get bumped and chipped, and there's some concerns of that. So, and if you pay attention to period examples, there are examples that there's some edging, it's called, that's flat, or there's some cock beading that wraps around. This is simply applied and glued down, and this is a perfect example of what a drawer front would be. So I'm going to pass that around because I like to keep you guys awake. There you go. So essentially, this is what they did in every single piece of period furniture, and it doesn't matter how you get there. It's all about the end result. So the end result is that you got a beautiful drawer front. Now, when it comes to veneer, and you have to make your own banding, I have a whole bunch of setup here, which I won't be passing around. So if you miss this out, then you missed out, because there's a lot of stuff. So these are kind of like little building blocks I like to show. You know, if we remember our kindergarten days, we were playing with fire blocks. Essentially, these are adult fire blocks. So if you can imagine, if we glue up, say, sections of white, and dark, white, dark, okay? You make these in about 36-inch lengths. And then what you do is you can cut small sections of this right off, okay? You see that in the camera?
Yep.
Okay, you cut this right off. You do the same thing with the bottom portion. You cut sections right off. And what you can do then is you can then intermix them, like so, and you can add a piece of veneer on top and bottom, and you have a banding, okay? So that's one option. So you can build that like that. The other option is to do the same thing with just 2 pieces of veneer. And with this, and if you have them like this, and if you cut sections off, you can then just flip every other one and forms a different kind of pattern for you. And again, you apply veneer on top and bottom to house that. Now, if you laminate that by adding 2 pairs on top and bottom, okay, you can go ahead and cross-cut sections off the end in a variety of different widths, okay? And what you can do is you can form this pattern. Can you see that? Okay. Now, if you decide to cut that same piece at certain angles, okay? So you got 1 piece, 2 piece. You can lay them down, and you can form. Let me grab a piece of veneer so you can see that. We put this on top and bottom and line this up properly so you can see it in the camera. This also forms a banding. You see that? Okay. Then if you take this and you fold them amongst each other and you flip one over, it forms about a herringbone pattern. So then you can go ahead and do something like this. What's amazing is that this is all basic stacking and laminating and flipping and orientating these in a certain way. And essentially what you have is a series of 10 or 15, even 20 different bandings just by simply stacking wood together. And again, what's great about these guys in the period is that they didn't have to weight anything. They can literally just grab all this, high glue, rub it back and forth, wait 15, 20 minutes, and they can continually be building. So they were very efficient with their time. And these are very common around here, especially because of Nathan Lombard. He was a kind of a country furniture maker, and he wasn't really trained. And he knew when he visited Boston or something like that in the area, what he saw. But he didn't know exactly how they made it, so he stuck with basic banding. And essentially, this is all he knew. He came up with one day, like, if I just flip this around, I can make a variety of different bandings, which is pretty interesting. Now, if banding was really made this easy in this thickness, that would be great. But you can imagine that these are about 1/16 of an inch, so it becomes much more labor intensive. And usually, in my research, I've determined that there were a lot of orphans and when in the period. And what happened was masters would take on these orphans and basically ask them to make banding for them. And for their time, he paid them back in food and shelter. And he quickly realized sooner or later that the boys didn't have really good attention span. So then he started taking on female little girls because they had smaller hands, they had nails that they grew out, and they had more of attention span. So a lot of these bandings, believe it or not, were made by females. That's kind of a new discovery. And a lot of them were being imported from overseas. So even back then, even though we don't hear about it too often, the importance of having small hands and females in the fields are very important. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay.
Sorry, I work at Colonial Williamsburg, and the more I know about women trades, the better. Do you know around what period they started having more?
Females?
Yeah, young.
To my knowledge, it's right from the get-go. They started with boys, and then they quickly migrated with girls. I'm not sure what convinced them, but usually because they were doing girl school boxes, were painting as well. So they were getting trained there, and I feel that, they saw how detailed and how focused they were. And some master came by and be like, I wonder if I can have him do the same thing with veneer. Now, this is kind of, with machines, started incorporating this kind of form, this kind of method, with blocks. And what they were using, they would still have foot-powered machines, or believe it or not, these guys are masters in sawing straight to the line. They had the skill, the capability of just ripping, hand planing, or cross-cutting, hand planing, cross-cutting, hand planing. But before any of that occurred, before the evolution of demand and everything else, you can imagine that these guys, essentially what they did was they laminated pieces in blocks, okay? And then they would saw these up I've seen these guys at Colonial Williamsburg, able to saw, mark this up with a cutting gauge and saw these down to about 3/32 of an inch consistently, or an eighth of an inch, and then hand plane down to eighth of an inch. So you can imagine that they were taking pieces like this and they were cutting strips. And then what they have is they have the capability of layering these up flat on the bench. Okay, if I orient this properly, they can go ahead and use wedges or use high glue and rub joint this back and forth. They can go ahead and form strips. So they would probably do this in 18 inches because they have the capability of controlling, cutting it in half, flipping it over to give them a 36, to give them that yard, to give them that meter, or slightly bigger than 36. And then what they can do is they can cut, then with a cutting gauge, they can simply slice off their bench or on the square edge of a board, cut strips, and then add a little stringing on either side with high glue, and they can rub joint that back and forth, and they quickly clamp that together and just hold it with their hands stretched out in small sections, and they have the desired width that they wanted. That's a possibility. I have a whole slideshow, but it's not today, that explains the whole process that I believe that, how they would have done it. And I think it's pretty amazing. I believe that when they first started, that everything was kind of just stacked and like resawed by hand, laminated them up like this, and they were cutting sections. And essentially when I do period restoration or conservation, this is my approach because I don't need that much length. I need only so much. Does anyone have any questions there? Good. So, next thing we want to talk about, because I like to share as much as I possibly can to kind of solve the mystery, solve the so-called secrets, is this is an ellipse here, very common. And the way I like to tell people is that if the ellipse stringing and banding all the way around is very clean and there's no jaggedness or there's no breakage, most often now in all my studies, it's a false ellipse. Okay? A false ellipse essentially is that there's a radius from here to here, and then there's a radius that goes a corner. It's not a true ellipse. A true ellipse is free-forming and it wraps around. And the true ellipse usually is very tight on the ends. And here is where stuff starts getting crazy. and starts getting jagged because it can't bend the veneer or that material in a tight radius so quickly. But on a false ellipse, this becomes very gradual. And when you really want to compare false ellipses, the false ellipse changes is like literally right here. This area right here is where it quickly, slowly progresses around, while an ellipse quickly wraps around. I wrote an article many years ago in Popular Woodworking that basically shows these craftsmen knew geometry, and they knew how to break down the math, and they can say, I want it to be so wide and so long. And they were able to break it all down geometrically to form the pattern that they wanted. And there's even mathematical equations that basically, I only care what the length is, I don't care what the width is. So sometimes you can get squattier ellipses, you can get really like football ellipses, or you can get them somewhat ideal ellipses. What I also determined in a lot of my research is that a lot of these areas, they appear to be 45, but majority of them, especially on Seymour furniture, which is what my main focus was, is that they look 45, they point to the corner, but most of them are not 45s. They just point to the corner, and it's kind of like, I need my line to point to that corner so it looks like it's 45. Okay, it could be 42, 40, 41. And what I also noticed is that a lot of the times where these intersect here is where it's a swing point for the ends. Okay, so you can also do it that way, which is really interesting. And then when these cross, and when these cross this way, when these cross this way, they also form a line down here where they intersect, and you can also swing point for above. So what also, for me, what that does for me is, I think that if I had a cutter, a scratch stock, I'm able to cut this radius, I'm ready to cut the radiuses on the bottom and on the ends, while this is already glued and veneered on the surface. So you can quickly see that these guys people were very innovative in what they were doing. The other thing is they took advantage of what the grain does visually, and you can see, even probably from across the room, how it pops in different colors. And that essentially is just all reflection of light, which is very interesting. It gives you a good 3D appearance. It really makes everything pop up really nicely. So what I like to do when it comes to any of this is I like to cut 245s on the corners, and instead of trying to measure this or fit any of this, you literally just slide the piece of veneer underneath it. You can scribe it with a knife, and you then cut it, or you can scribe it in surface and then cut it, and literally it's all just taped together, which works really well. And literally you can lay this on the center lines. You can put a little double-sided tape if you want to do modern day, or you can put tacks of high glue in a couple places, and you can literally scribe this all the way around, and this literally will fit into the surface like so, and it's ready for veneering as a solid core piece. Because remember, this is all done piece by piece overseas and probably brought in. Occasionally you probably find craftsmen who do this on site, and essentially you can take this whole substrate backed up and you can go ahead and veneer the whole thing, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so does anyone have any questions there? No? No questions. What time is it?
11:06.
So I can continue going because I keep bringing a ton of stuff. I'd rather get you numb in the brain than leaving here saying I wish I knew more. So we have this banding called Lunette banding, another great Massachusetts banding. Okay. So essentially, if I put this underneath here, that's a form of banding that's made in Boston. Now, the interesting part about this is that the man who made this, which I forgot his name right off the top of my head, when he was advertising during the Seymour's heydays, he popped up as an inlay specialist. And years down the road, it popped up in New York, and we quickly realized it's possible it's the same guy. Then this popped up in Virginia, happens to be the same guy and his son. It popped up in New Orleans. He happens to be in the same area. It popped up in New Orleans. So it basically tells you that this guy made this banding. because it doesn't pop anywhere else unless this guy's in the neighborhood. So I think that's pretty cool and interesting about the history. Now, there's several ways to do this, but it's possible that these guys did it with a hot pipe and then did this out of solid pieces of veneer. That's one option. When I looked at the Duncan Fife tool chest in New York with Don Williams, one of the conservators or ex-conservators of Smithsonian, we noticed that Duncan Fife had tools that appeared to be handheld or brace cutting plug cutters. And the reason we thought that is because it just looked like a plug cutter but had a center point. And since I drool over Seymour Furniture, I noticed that at one point there was a series of furniture that had a small center point, but none of the other ones had center points. And you started noticing that the radiuses on the lunette banding were changing in dimension. And we quickly thought to ourselves, it's possible that at one point the maker who was making lunette banding maybe figured out or was able to invest on a bit brace with a center point for cutting plugs. So my approach on this is I'm essentially using plug cutters from Lee Valley or Fuller Bit Company in Rhode Island. And essentially what I'm doing here is I'm basically boring holes, and I have to bore them every other one because of the structure of the wood. Once I glue the plugs in, I'm able to then just flush them up to get that result. Once I have that result, I then bore smaller holes, but now I can bore all of them because there's enough wood structure supporting each side. I will then plug those holes where smaller plugs, which have been sand shaded in a hot sand. And then once that's dry, I'm able to split them in half, and I can form this banding here, like so, like I already explained. Or I can take both of them and I can stagger them to give them more of a 3D sweeping S-curve look, which you do see on Seymour Furniture. So it's amazing what you can do with plug cutters and a little bit of hot sand. Does that make sense? All right. Well, that's all I got for you, so unless you have some questions. Yes, of course. Yes, sir.
So, when you draw your ellipse, you actually draw it in parts?
Yes, I draw up.
You draw the separate arcs for the sides and tips?
Yes.
Not like the string and the...
No. I do one quadrant, essentially, and then I'm able to fold that paper in quarters, and I can just highlight that and give me the size to visually look at it, and then that's it. And it works really good. And then you can make a pattern, and you can basically use that as a form to make templates. And it's amazing, the result. And if you wanted to, for sideboard doors or anything else, there's enough space there to actually draw the lines in geometry and just swing point them all. And they just all connect. And it's just like amazing. And I've tested a lot of the bandings of how pliable they are in true ellipses and false ellipses. Majority of them don't want to bend on the true ellipse, but boy, do they love bending on a false ellipse. It's absolutely amazing. And it's amazing what you can do with it.
Question.
Yes, sir.
I came in late, so you may have covered it. And everybody's got a story. How'd you get here? I mean...
I drove here today.
What was your journey to...
Oh, okay.
And how old are you?
I'm 35 years old. I've been doing this professionally since 2004. I went to the Furniture Institute of Mass, which unfortunately not enough people know about it, so everyone says, oh, you went to North Bennett. And it's basically the same thing, but it's much more 1:6 ratio versus 3:40 or 4:44 today. So still 1:6. Phil, my mentor, Phil Lowe, he graduated from North Bennett Street School. So essentially the information is exactly the same. You can almost say I'm a third generation from his instructor. I, fell in love with Norm Abrams like everyone else did, and fell in love with Roy Underhill like everyone else did. And basically I was like Norm. I was like Roy Underhill. I was like that guy with an axe in the city. And I was kind of like, I didn't belong in the city. I belonged doing something else. So I just fell in love with it since the age of 10, since my uncle gave me a Stanley toolbox, a kid's like tool chest, which I regret don't have any of those tools. So it'd be good to have today. And I basically made my first 8 green benches, and it's about 30 years later almost, or 35 or 25 years later, and some of them still exist. and just been falling in love with it ever since. And I thought I'd become a full-time furniture maker, but then you quickly realize it's not that hard to make a box these days. So I decided to do what no one else wants to do, and that's restore furniture. But if the margins are right, then I do make some furniture on for sale. But most of what I do now is restoration.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in the ghetto of Hartford, Connecticut. Had a really rough upbringing. So it's a different life that I live today than back then. So in a nutshell, my family ran the streets of Hartford. They ran gangs, and a lot of them are in life sentences in jail. I'm kind of an oddball. So, and I worked hard to be different. I'm kind of an outsider in my family, so I'm different. Thank you.
Where's your shop located? Where do you
My shop is located in Littleton. I most likely will be expanding and taking over our old restoration shop from who's a friend of mine, the owner of that, and he wants to become an employee because he's in his mid-60s, so that'll probably be in Acton. But I still keep that small format, like these craftsmen had a small space, and they were able to do a ton of furniture. It's like Townsend and Daughters. They had, 6 craftsmen in a 10 by 10 or 10 by 12, and they were able to make all these block fronts. So I have, my main space is 350 square feet, and I have a section for finishing, and then after that, with a combination of hand tools and a small set of power tools, I can build whatever I want. So.
When you do the inlays in the center of the work, the odd-shaped stuff, you generally just trace it out and cut it?
Yeah, I try to keep it pretty simple. But if I do some stringing, if I do have to do a lot of stringing for like line and bury, Steve Lotta came up with a set of tools from Lee Nelson that are really good, and those work great. But I also have the Lee Valley Dremel tool set that they have, which I think is unbelievable. It has a beautiful plunge set, has great center finding. You can go ahead and do all these arcs and curves and everything else. And that speeds up really quickly, and you can buy cutters from a supplier, I think in Minnesota, and that sells cutters by 64th increments. So you can mic your stringing if you want to be that anal and get the desired bits, and they cut great. They're solid carbide. So if you're a hand power tool junkie, that works out really well too. So, yes, sir.
If you had an older piece of furniture that some of the veneer was coming loose, but it was still there,
Yep.
how do you put it back down?
There's 2 options. I would use high glue, number 1, period.
Okay.
And if you don't want to invest in the glue pot and you're intimidated about how quick this sets, then my friend and mentor Patrick Edwards makes Old Brown glue, and it's high glue with urea and another additive. And what that does, it gives you 30-minute open time before you have to look for a clamp. And
It's like a joint, and I
yes.
curl over.
Well, you have to be aware if there's only one, then it's fine. If there's multiple ones are popping up, means that something is moving and contracting and expanding. So it may not want to bend down. Sometimes what happens if it breaks, the length then becomes too long. So you may have to remove a little bit of material. But usually you can soften it up, put a little bit of high glue, and if you want, you can use like bending plywood if it's curved, or there's a soundboard material from Home Depot called Homo Soot.
Yeah.
And that's very easy to apply there. Use wax paper if you had to. And then if you use high glue, you don't have to worry about any splotches. You can clean it up with cold
Usually
water.
push it back down and
Yeah.
get it to stay.
Just stay. 24 hours at least. You can use Scotch tape or whatever. That works out really well too. Any other questions? You're more than happy to come up and look at some of my veneer saws, or if you have any other questions. But thank you for coming out.